3 encounters, 3 lawsuits, 3 judges examining the same question. Not whether something went wrong, not whether someone was harmed, not even whether a constitutional right was violated. Instead, the legal system asks a narrower, more technical question. Was the law clearly established enough that the officer should personally pay for what happened? That question sits at the center of one of the most debated doctrines in American civil rights law. It determines whether a case proceeds to trial or ends before a jury ever hears the evidence. It decides whether a constitutional claim results in accountability or whether it effectively disappears inside procedural law. That doctrine is known as qualified immunity. Supporters argue it protects public officials who must make difficult decisions under pressure. Critics argue it prevents accountability even when rights are violated. But beyond public debate, courts apply qualified immunity through a structured legal analysis that often looks very different from how incidents are discussed in public. Today, we are not examining opinions. We are examining how courts actually apply this doctrine in real cases, using real encounters and real legal reasoning. Because once you understand how qualified immunity functions in practice, the entire conversation changes. The question stops being, "Was this fair?" and becomes something more technical and more revealing. What kind of legal clarity must exist before constitutional violations can produce civil liability? To answer that question, we begin not with a case, but with the structure of the doctrine itself. When someone claims a government official violated their constitutional rights, they may bring a civil lawsuit under federal law. These claims often arise from police encounters involving force, arrest, search, or retaliation for speech. Before the case reaches a jury, courts apply a legal filter. That filter is qualified immunity. Courts generally analyze immunity using 2 central questions. First, did the official's conduct violate a constitutional right? Second, was that right clearly established at the time of the conduct? If the answer to either question is no, the case may be dismissed before trial. At first glance, this structure appears straightforward, but its practical consequences are significant. Courts are permitted to address the second question first. That means a court can dismiss a case by concluding the law was not clearly established, without ever ruling whether a constitutional violation occurred. This procedural feature shifts the focus of litigation. Instead of evaluating wrongdoing in the abstract, courts examine legal notice. They ask whether prior judicial decisions had already defined the conduct as unlawful in sufficiently similar circumstances. The phrase "clearly established law" does not mean obvious wrongdoing. It does not mean common sense. It does not mean a right recognized in general terms. It refers to precedent. Earlier court decisions that would have placed a reasonable official on notice that specific conduct was unlawful. In practice, this means constitutional protections develop through comparison. Lawyers search for earlier cases. Judges evaluate similarity between factual scenarios. Outcomes may turn on how closely a prior decision resembles the present one. This structure produces a distinctive feature of civil rights litigation. Rights are defined not only by constitutional text, but by the accumulation of judicial decisions applying that text to concrete situations. To see how this plays out in real encounters, we begin with the area where these disputes most often arise: use of force. When courts evaluate use of force by police officers, they apply what is known as an objective reasonableness standard. The central question is whether the force used was reasonable from the perspective of an officer on the scene at the time of the event. This perspective requirement shapes the entire analysis. Courts attempt to reconstruct the encounter as it appeared in real time, rather than as it appears during later review. That distinction becomes especially important in the age of video evidence. Modern audiences often analyze incidents frame by frame. Video can be paused, slowed, replayed, and scrutinized from multiple angles. The law, however, attempts to evaluate decisions made within fractions of a second under conditions of uncertainty. When assessing force, courts commonly consider several contextual factors. These include the severity of the suspected offense, whether the individual posed an immediate threat, and whether the individual was actively resisting or attempting to flee. Importantly, injury alone does not determine legality. A severe outcome does not automatically indicate excessive force. The inquiry focuses on the reasonableness of the decision at the moment it was made. Qualified immunity enters the analysis only after a potential constitutional violation is identified. Even if a court concludes force was excessive, the officer may still be shielded unless prior case law clearly prohibited that level of force in similar circumstances. This interaction between reasonableness and legal clarity forms the foundation of many immunity decisions. Consider an encounter in Scottsdale involving a physical takedown during a police response call. Body-worn camera footage captures a rapid escalation from verbal interaction to physical restraint. The individual appears stationary. The officer initiates a forceful maneuver. The incident leads to litigation alleging excessive force. In analyzing such a case, courts examine the officer's perception of threat. Was there reason to believe the individual posed immediate danger? Was resistance occurring? What information was available at the moment force was applied? If a court concludes the force may have been excessive, the inquiry shifts. Was it clearly established that using this level of force under these circumstances was unconstitutional? That question requires comparison to earlier judicial decisions. If prior cases have addressed similar fact patterns and found them unlawful, immunity may be denied. If prior cases differ in significant ways, immunity may be granted even if the conduct is later deemed unconstitutional. This is the legal environment in which force cases unfold. The doctrine does not ask only whether conduct was wrong. It asks whether the legal boundary had already been drawn with sufficient clarity. We now turn to a different type of encounter, one that illustrates the second prong of immunity analysis in a particularly direct way. Imagine a traffic stop in Newton. A driver is subjected to field sobriety testing. A breathalyzer reading registers 0. Despite this result, an arrest occurs. Litigation follows, alleging unlawful arrest. At first glance, the issue appears simple. If objective evidence indicates no impairment, why would an arrest occur? But the legal inquiry is not limited to that question. Courts examine probable cause, whether the officer had a reasonable basis to believe an offense occurred. They review the officer's observations, training, and interpretation of behavior. They evaluate whether the decision was reasonable based on information available at the time. If a court concludes probable cause was lacking, the analysis continues. Was it clearly established that arresting under these specific circumstances violated the Constitution? Here, the doctrine's requirement for factual similarity becomes decisive. Courts look for earlier decisions involving comparable conditions, similar tests, similar observations, similar conclusions. The presence or absence of such precedent can determine whether the case proceeds. This illustrates a defining feature of qualified immunity. Constitutional rights may exist in principle, yet liability depends on whether prior decisions have applied those principles to comparable situations. This incremental development of law means that new factual scenarios test the boundaries of existing precedent. Some claims expand those boundaries. Others do not survive the immunity analysis. To understand how evidence influences these determinations, we turn to the role of recording technology in modern litigation. For much of American legal history, courts reconstructed encounters through testimony and written reports. Witness credibility, memory, and documentation shaped factual findings. The widespread adoption of recording technology altered that process. Body-worn cameras, dashboard cameras, and civilian recordings introduced an independent visual record. Video evidence can clarify events. It can resolve disputes about movement, timing, and sequence. It can also introduce new interpretive questions. Camera angle, lighting, perspective, and audio quality influence what is perceived. Courts generally consider video highly persuasive when it clearly contradicts a factual claim. However, when footage is ambiguous, traditional evidentiary analysis continues to apply. Consider a highway stop involving the Kansas Highway Patrol. A vehicle is pulled over. A warning is issued. The officer returns to the vehicle and continues questioning. Litigation later alleges the stop was extended without legal justification. In evaluating such a case, courts examine the sequence of events. Did the stop truly conclude? Was the driver free to leave? Did subsequent interaction constitute a voluntary encounter or a continued detention? Video may provide critical evidence regarding timing, tone, and positioning. It may reveal whether an individual reasonably believed they could depart. If a court concludes the detention was unlawful, the analysis again turns to immunity. Was it clearly established that continuing the interaction under these conditions violated constitutional protections against unreasonable seizure? The presence of video does not eliminate legal analysis. Instead, it shapes factual determination, which in turn influences the immunity inquiry. This evolving relationship between technology and doctrine continues to redefine how civil rights litigation unfolds. We now examine an area of constitutional law where the central issue is not force or detention, but speech. Encounters involving recording and expression introduce a different legal dynamic. Many federal courts have recognized a First Amendment right to record public officials performing duties in public spaces. Litigation in this area often centers on retaliation, whether government action was taken because of protected expression. Unlike force cases, which focus heavily on perceived threat, retaliation claims examine motive and causation. Courts analyze whether adverse action would have occurred absent the protected speech. Consider an encounter on Long Island involving an individual recording police activity. The interaction escalates. Allegations arise that an officer attempted to interfere with recording by directing light into the camera. In evaluating such a claim, courts assess whether the conduct constituted retaliation for protected expression. They examine context, intent, and effect. If a court concludes retaliation occurred, immunity analysis follows. Was the right to record under these specific circumstances clearly established at the time? As with other areas of civil rights law, outcomes depend on precedent. Courts compare earlier decisions recognizing recording rights and evaluate similarity in factual context. Across these domains, force, arrest, search, and speech, one pattern persists. Qualified immunity does not primarily evaluate harm. It evaluates legal clarity. To fully understand the doctrine's persistence, we must examine the rationale underlying its development. The doctrine of qualified immunity reflects an attempt to balance competing concerns. Government officials often perform duties requiring discretionary judgment under uncertain conditions. Courts have expressed concern that fear of personal liability could discourage decisive action or deter individuals from public service. At the same time, civil liability provides a mechanism for enforcing constitutional rights. Without such mechanisms, rights may exist in principle but lack practical protection. Qualified immunity attempts to reconcile these considerations by shielding officials from liability unless the law clearly prohibited their conduct. This balance has been shaped through decisions of the United States Supreme Court, which has articulated and refined the doctrine through interpretation of federal civil rights statutes. Supporters of the doctrine emphasize protection for reasonable mistakes. Critics emphasize barriers to accountability. Courts, however, apply the doctrine through precedent rather than policy debate. Understanding this framework clarifies why outcomes sometimes diverge from public expectations. Legal analysis operates within structured criteria that may prioritize notice and precedent over broader evaluations of fairness. As we synthesize these observations, a coherent picture emerges. Across multiple domains of constitutional litigation, qualified immunity functions as a gatekeeping doctrine. It determines not only outcomes in individual cases, but also how constitutional protections evolve over time. The doctrine channels legal development through comparison. Each case asks whether existing precedent sufficiently addressed the conduct at issue. Some decisions expand clarity. Others maintain uncertainty. Recording technology has become a significant factor in this process. Video can shape factual findings, influence reasonableness analysis, and provide evidence relevant to constitutional claims. It does not replace legal doctrine, but it interacts with it in consequential ways. Ultimately, qualified immunity defines a particular model of accountability. Liability depends not only on whether rights exist, but on how clearly those rights were articulated before the encounter occurred. This structure means constitutional law develops incrementally, through accumulated judicial decisions responding to specific factual scenarios. Each case contributes to an evolving map of constitutional boundaries. Each recording becomes part of that record, and each ruling answers the same foundational question: how clearly must the law speak before accountability becomes legally possible? That question continues to shape the landscape of civil rights litigation and the meaning of constitutional protection in practice. At Incident Uncovered, we follow the record, not the assumption. If you want more evidence-based breakdowns of real law enforcement procedures, subscribe and enable notifications. Each episode is structured from verified documentation official process, and investigative timelines. Because understanding how cases unfold starts with seeing what was recorded.